My primary area of expertise is neuroscience. So why am I talking tonight about cholesterol and heart disease? Well, I have a great interest in this topic. The reason being that some years ago, I was actually diagnosed as being in high risk for developing heart disease. And as a result of that high risk for heart disease, I developed a passion to learn about heart disease. So I'm going to share with you, by way of introduction, some of my blood test results. And you'll see that they were a bit scary. So on the first slide, as you look either to the far end, either side, triglycerides are fats that are in the blood. And what you would like to have is your triglyceride being 150 or less. And so as you can see, my triglycerides were sky high. They were above 600. This was in 2005. As well, my cholesterol was way off. I had sky-high LDL. I didn't have much of the good cholesterol. And so my ratio of total cholesterol to the LDL was way too high. So the solution to me was simple. I would change my diet, cut back on the beef, cut back on the fat, and pump some iron. A little exercise. That's not me, by the way. Yeah. Pump some iron, do some exercise, and I would take care of the problem. Well, here we are a couple of years later, and things were going in the wrong direction. My triglycerides were now beyond sky high. They were stratospheric. So I was now up to 800, which put me at high risk for heart disease. My cholesterol wasn't improving either, so things were really ugly. My blood was full of fat, and worse than that, I was fat. So in 2007, I turned 50 years of age, and I realized that I was fat and getting fatter, and I had obesity and heart disease in my future. So my doctor absolutely urged me, and cardiologist as well, said that I had to go on medication. In fact, my doctor said I was kidding myself. Diet and exercise was not working for me, so what I needed to do was take medication to lower my blood lipids. I decided, instead of going to the pharmacy, that instead I would go to the library. I decided that I needed to become an expert in heart disease and triglycerides, blood lipids, as well as why it was that I was getting so fat. So I decided to become an expert in heart disease. So during the day, I was a neuroscientist. In my evenings and weekends, I spent learning about heart disease. And what I've learned is pretty ugly. What I've learned in this area of research, to me, is very different from neuroscience. I've learned that it's fraught with conflict of interest, fraud, and overall incompetence in the area of heart disease. So that's the myths that I will be talking about tonight that people generally accept as fact. These myths have resulted from the poorly conducted research in this area. So the first myth that I will address is that people think that food high in saturated fat and cholesterol, such as beef and butter, will clog your arteries and make you fat, cause heart disease. And I'm going to try to convince you that that is a myth. The second myth, again related to that, cholesterol clogs arteries, causes heart disease, and what I'll also try to convince you is that you will live longer if you lower your cholesterol with medication. And finally, the overall theme of what I'm going to talk about is that we have been misled. We have been given misinformation from food and drug company supported research. We have also been misled by government sponsored advice as to food that we should eat and drugs that we should take. So sit back and listen, put on your seatbelts. Here we go. So the first thing I wanted to understand was, why is it that I was getting fat? So I needed to understand the cause of obesity. And what I learned is that obesity is not only related to heart disease, it's basically related to every disease you see in modern society. So not only was I at risk for developing heart disease, I was actually at risk for developing all these other diseases you see as well. So I needed to fully understand what is it that causes obesity. So I decided to understand everything, beginning with a history of the study of obesity. Now here's a man, his name was William Banting. He lived in England in the 19th century. And he was the first person sort of to be studied scientifically who was obese. William Banting, at 60 years of age, was 5'5" and weighed over 200 pounds, and he lived in England. And he had health problems that are typical of any obese person. So he went to his doctor, and the doctor was absolutely brilliant. The doctor recommended that he cut the carbohydrates in his diet. He told him you can eat as much meat as you want, just don't eat potatoes, bread, or anything sweet. So at 60 years of age, William Banting began this diet, and he lost 46 pounds. He enjoyed great health after this point. He lived well into his 80s, and he had no clogged arteries. And the reason why we know about William Banting is that he wrote a book. He was so excited about his progress with this kind of diet that he wrote a book and detailed exactly what he ate and how much weight that he lost. He called it Letter on Corpulence, and it was a bestseller in England in 1864. 10,000 books were sold. People lost weight using this diet, and they wrote back to Banting and his diet and his doctor about how successful the diet was. These observations continued in the 19th century. You have many doctors, many books being written to show that as people were eating more refined sugar and people were eating potatoes and bread, you find an association between that diet and people gaining weight and becoming obese. And in fact, later in the 19th century, in this book published in 1892, written by Dr. Emmett Densmore, and in fact, right on the cover of the book, he says, this is a statement of principal arguments against the use of bread, cereal, pulses, which are beans, potatoes, and all other starch foods. The book was written to say, don't eat starchy foods. And a quote from in his book is, an obese person may be given a diet of meat, excluding bread and potatoes, and the patient will reduce to his normal weight. As soon as the patient returns to his diet of bread and potatoes, straight away he begins to increase in weight. Now into the 20th century, you see extensive scientific studies of obesity, which are summarized by one of the leaders of the field, who was Alfred Pennington. Dr. Alfred Pennington summarized the work in the 1940s and 50s. He was the leader in the study of obesity and helping people to lose weight. So he published in New England Journal of Medicine. It's one of the reviews that he wrote. And if you look at what Pennington had, it was completely successful and followed what Banting had shown in his diet. So here is a quote directly from the publication. And you can see that, you can read that down there, or I'll read it for you. How do you stop being obese? This is what you should eat. 1/2 pound or more of fresh meat with the fat. This diet is unlimited. You can eat as much meat as you want. But he says, most of the meat you buy is not fat enough. So get extra fat. Pretty funny now, but that was medical science in the 1950s. He emphasized, if you want to stop being obese, you want to lose weight, do not eat bread, flour, sugar, salt, or alcohol. So we won't deal with the salt part of it, but on everything else he was right. Now, what's great about science is that when you've got the right effect, it will be found over and over by people independently. There's now a paper in 1963 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA. And these people thought they had made a discovery. They thought they had a novel treatment for obesity, because in their clinic they had one treatment that worked. And it's right there underlined at the top. This diet is planned around reducing carbohydrates. That is, reducing bread, potatoes, and sugar. And you see here, this is a graph of the weight of a woman who was obese. And when she reduced the amount of carbohydrates in her diet, she lost a dramatic amount of weight. And in fact, it emphasizes, the thing about this diet is that the patient felt no hunger, that it was easy to lose the weight. Now, of course, you can lose weight as long as you have reduced calories. But the important thing about this science here is that it emphasizes how easy it is for an obese person to lose weight eating as much meat, butter, and fat as they want, as long as they cut the carbohydrates. And then, of course, we have Dr. Atkins. We have the Atkins diet in 1972. Atkins, who was demonized, the vilified Atkins diet. And I've read both books. The Atkins diet book was not revolutionary. It was not a fad diet, and it wasn't Atkins' idea. Effectively, there is no difference in what Atkins wrote in 1972 with what Banting wrote in 1864. The science for over 100 years was showing very consistently that if you want to lose weight, you want to stop being obese, cut the carbohydrates, and eat as much fat and protein as you want. All right, so I was a bit cynical though. Fine, you'll lose weight. So what that means is you'll be thinner, but you're still going to have a heart attack. Okay, fine. You'll leave a thinner corpse is what's going to happen if you eat the Atkins diet. And so it sounds so hard to believe. And Atkins said, you eat red meat, full-fat cheese, butter, and eggs. Well, that's got to increase your cholesterol and it's got to kill you. Well, actually, that's not the case. That's simply a myth. Eating red meat, eating butter, eating fat does not increase your cholesterol. Now, there are many studies I can show you, but we'd be here all night. I'm showing you this one study because it combines a few different factors. You have people who are basically on a very low-carb diet, which is also called a ketogenic diet. These people are obese, and some had very high cholesterol, and some had normal cholesterol. So this kind of puts it together in one study. And what is it that they could eat? Unlimited fish, meat, chicken, eggs, and full-fat cheese. And vegetables that have complex carbohydrates. And they could eat oil. And in this case, they weren't eating butter, just happens to be the country they're in. But the same findings occur when people can eat butter or olive oil. What could they not eat? Just as with Banting. This is from 2006. So we have now for 150 years studies showing that you need to restrict the carbohydrates. So they restricted the flour, potato, the rice, the sugar. When they restricted the carbohydrates, and of course they've replicated what you had going back to the time of Banting, the Atkins diet. So here you see their body weight. People lost a dramatic amount of weight, so they were no longer obese. You have people who have high cholesterol and people who have normal cholesterol. Both groups lost a significant amount of weight. And again, there's a sense that they could do it effortlessly. But what's more important is that this study shows the blood lipids, the fat in the blood. And this study is consistent with all the other studies I've found. So if you look here, the HDL, that's the good cholesterol. So by eating meat, eating fat, they raise their good cholesterol over the course of the year. The total cholesterol dropped dramatically. So the people who have 7, that's equivalent to about 290. Okay? Cholesterol dropped dramatically. Triglycerides, again, the one that I'm so concerned about. Fat in the blood dropped from extremely high levels down to normal. The bad cholesterol dropped, the ratio improved, and what's most important, ultimately it's sugar in the blood that can kill you. And these people had type 2 diabetes. If you look down at blood glucose, that is dropping dramatically in the people when they're just eating the meat, the fat, and the protein. So there is no evidence, it is a myth, that eating saturated fat, eating meat, eating butter, increases cholesterol. So every indication of good heart health is going in the right direction when you cut out the carbohydrates. Okay, so hopefully now in just 10 minutes I've given you 150 years of history, which is completely contrary to what you believed when you came in tonight. Think about it, low-carb diet. You can eat as much red meat as you want, you'll lose weight, and you'll lower your cholesterol. I guess you can see I'm not about to have this talk sponsored by a drug company. Maybe by Charlie's Steakhouse or Bern's Steakhouse. Definitely not something the drug companies would want to invite me to talk about. But that's what the science indicates. So, I learned all about this, and then I had the idea, well, if eating meat reduces your cholesterol, and carbohydrates are really the problem, then if you eat carbohydrates, that is, if you eat sugar, will that raise your cholesterol? And in fact, there is a massive medical research literature that shows that when you eat carbohydrates, it actually raises your cholesterol. It creates fat. And here's just one study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. So all this work is published in high-quality medical journals in which they kept fat in the diet constant and manipulated the amount of sugar in the diet. And so if you look at the graph, what you've got are people that have high triglycerides and high cholesterol when they're having their normal diet. And when they eliminated sugar from the diet, the cholesterol and the triglycerides plummeted down to healthy levels. And then when they added sugar to their diets, only changing one factor, and that was sugar. When they added sugar to their diet, the triglycerides went sky high, in fact, just to the level that I was at. And the cholesterol went over 300 when they added sugar to their diet. Eliminate sugar again, that's the last part of the graph, and everything came back to normal, to ideal levels. So it is the manipulation of sugar that influences cholesterol and triglycerides. It is not eating fat and protein. It is eating sugar that raises cholesterol and triglycerides. So we return to me. At this point, I had now gained some confidence that the treatment would not be drugs, but my treatment would be the Banting-Atkins type diet. I needed to cut the carbohydrates in my diet to see if I could bring my triglycerides down. And so in 2007, I began tentatively, because I really had a passion for sugar, and this was tough for me to do. So at first, and of course everyone's telling me with all the meat I was eating that I was going to clog my arteries, so I had to deal with people saying, like my wife who says, you're eating steak every day. You've got to eat something else. So at first I started by reducing sugar, and then it accelerated. And so now you can see up to this past month the result of the change in my diet. And so it actually dropped quite dramatically when I cut the sugar after 2007. And in this past year, I've gone completely over to the Atkins side, and I've gone now to only about 10% of my calories are from carbohydrates, and 70% are fat. So I now eat every day eggs, butter, beef, and chicken, and now I can have roast chicken with the skin on. It's something I had avoided for years. It tastes so magnificent. And I eat full-fat cheese and coconut, which is almost pure saturated fat, and dark chocolate, nuts, and vegetables. So, those are my triglycerides. The cholesterol ratio was a bit resistant until the past year when I really went very low in carbs. And that has come closer to normalizing. And finally, what I'm also very pleased to report is that I'm no longer on my way toward obesity, and my weight is practically back to where it was 30 years ago when I was in college. So everything has worked for me. Now, my doctor said in the beginning when I told him I would be using the Atkins diet, he told me, as well as cardiologists told me, that I was taking a bad situation and making it worse. They were insistent that I would raise my cholesterol and my triglycerides. My doctor has followed my progress over the years with these changes, and he tells me that I'm an anomaly. He doesn't understand. He says, you're eating all this fat, and your cholesterol and your triglycerides are dropping. And I said, I'm not an anomaly. This is science. The science predicted that my blood lipids should drop when I cut the sugar. My doctor, by the way, is now on Lipitor. Okay? I couldn't convince him to cut the carbs. So, we have a current state of confusion, because I think what I'm telling you now is so contrary to what everyone believes. We've been led to fear cholesterol in our food, and yet cholesterol in your food does not affect your blood cholesterol. Eggs do not produce heart disease. There's never been any evidence of that, and there will never be evidence of that. So we don't need to avoid eggs like the plague, as it says in this cartoon. This is part of the problem. You look around, and what is it we see on the advertisements, in the stores, when it comes to food? The American Heart Association recommends that you have lean meat, low-fat food, skim milk. The current way of thinking is eat as little fat as possible. So you see the cheese is fat-free. Almost all the yogurt, fat-free. You don't even have real butter. You got fake butter that's also low fat. And look at how these cookies that you got in this ad, they're bragging about the fact that the cookies are fat-free. Isn't this wonderful? These cookies are pure sugar. It's like they're selling it as a health food. Well, again, just to remind you, in case your mind has been wandering, okay, you forgot about the fat part from the 1950s. Remember look at how different this is from what Pennington had been talking about in the 1950s. How to be healthy, how to live longer, and how to lose weight. Eat lots of fat and protein. So look how far we've come from the medical science of the 1950s to what people believe is healthy now. So what are the consequences? Now, we have fat phobia. Well, one thing is that because people are afraid of eating fat, what they're doing instead is eating carbohydrates. And you look at now what have Americans been eating in the past 30 years. There is no change as far as the amount of fat and protein in the American diet. That's two lines at the bottom. What has changed dramatically is the amount of carbohydrates that Americans are eating. You see this increase in carbohydrate, and the result is obesity. Americans are getting fat as a result of eating more carbohydrates. You see now that we're up to about 1/3 of all adult Americans are obese, and obesity is also increasing in children. And this is clearly related to the increase in consumption of carbohydrates. So this meal clearly is a recipe for obesity. The sugar in the soda and the potatoes and the bread in this meal are the worst things about it. Eliminate all those factors, those components, eat the hamburger and the cheese, and you'll be healthy. It's a very different, unexpected message that I think you're hearing tonight than you would have expected. All right, so what I'm suggesting is the message to someone who is obese, who would like to lose weight, is first, there should be a national message. President Obama should go on TV and say, it's okay. The Atkins diet is good for you. Eat meat. Lose weight. You know, he's campaigning for president, so maybe he can do that along with his campaign for re-election. So the message I'm suggesting is, the science says that if you cut the carbs, you will lose weight, that it is healthy, and so cut the potatoes, the bread, and anything sweet. It is nothing to fear. So the first myth that I have addressed is that food high in saturated fat and cholesterol, such as beef and butter, will make you fat and cause heart disease. There is no reason to believe that. There's no science that supports that myth. So hopefully I've either smashed that myth to you or at least giving you second thoughts about it. How is it that our food recommendations have gone so far awry? Why is it that we have fat phobia? What happened since the 1950s to change the way people think about fat? Well, in the 1950s, it was a dramatic increase that was recognized in heart disease. About half of all Americans who had died of heart disease. And here you can see this dramatic increase in heart disease occurring in America. And no one really understood why we had this increase in people dying of heart disease. And on top of that, President Eisenhower, 1955, had a heart attack. And later, after he was no longer president, he died of a heart attack. And so you had a country now that was so concerned and obsessed with heart disease, and no one was providing the answer as to why so many Americans were having heart attacks. And one man provided the answer. That man was Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys went on national television in 1956, and he said, I have the answer. I can explain why Americans have so many heart attacks. And he was on all 3 networks, and he was very convincing because he showed this graph. This is one of the most famous graphs in nutrition heart disease history because he showed a clear linear relationship between people dying of heart disease across countries and the amount of fat they ate in the diet. So you see these countries right here, from Japan, which had the lowest amount of fat and the lowest heart disease, to the US, which was at the top. So clearly the reason why Americans were dying of heart disease was because they were eating too much fat. The problem with this graph is that Ancel Keys cheated. This is fraud. This is one of the most powerful graphs in heart disease history, and it was a result of fraud. He actually had data from 22 countries. Ancel Keys selected 6 to create this graph. And he was called out on this. This isn't a secret that I found out. People published papers to say that he cheated. Here is one such paper by Yerushalmi and Hilbo, in which they said Keys didn't explain why he picked those 6 countries to create this linear relationship. We're going to analyze data from all 22 countries. And when they did, you see that there is a random scatter of data. You look at 20 of the 22 points, and it's completely random. And there is no statistical significance when one looks at heart disease and fat in the diet, when you look at all 22 countries. And further, an expert in heart disease and nutrition and epidemiology, the study of diseases, was John Yudkin. And Yudkin said, let's look at other components of the diet. And we had data available at the time for 15 countries in which we could compare sugar in the diet with fat in the diet. And Yudkin pointed out that when you have those 15 countries side by side, there's absolutely no relation between fat in the diet and people dying of heart disease. But there is a significant relation between the amount of sugar that people eat and people dying of heart disease. And what were the experts trying to tell the public at the time? George Mann was one of the best cardiovascular researchers in the second half of the 20th century. He began in the 1940s, continued well into the 1990s, and he was one of the top cardiovascular researchers. And what did he say about what Ancel Keys had unloaded on Americans? He said, a generation of citizens has grown up since the diet-heart hypothesis was launched as official dogma. They have been misled by the greatest scientific deception of our times, the notion that consumption of animal fat causes heart disease. He was completely ignored. But if we now go to the present, to absolutely emphasize to you that these are not individual studies that I'm depending on. When we look at what's called a meta-analysis, in which we look at 50 years of study on fat in the diet and heart disease, and that's what this work did, and that work published a couple of years ago. They looked at all the studies on heart disease and diet, and their conclusion was absolutely crystal clear and unequivocal. Intake of fat was not significantly associated with heart disease or mortality. Intake of saturated fat, animal fat, was not associated with heart disease or mortality. And you did not reduce heart disease by reducing the fat in your diet. You are not more likely to live longer if you reduce the animal fat and replace it with vegetable fat. Absolutely clear. This is what the science is showing right up to the present day. And yet fat phobia continues. And the absolute top expert, stating basically the theme for my talk tonight, Walter Willett has published over 1,000 papers on diet and health. He is the expert in America on diet. He has studied over 300,000 people over the course of decades. What he says is that his work clearly contradicts the low-fat is good health message. The exclusive focus in America on the adverse effects of fat may have contributed to the obesity epidemic. Now, you would think that Ancel Keys, being shown that he had committed fraud, should have just climbed under a rock and he should have never have been heard of again. But instead, Ancel Keys became the leader in American nutrition research. He was a powerful figure. After he was on television in the 1950s, he took over. Ancel Keys became the editor of a very important medical journal, Circulation. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine saying absolutely everything that is incorrect. He is saying that animal fat causes heart disease. He is saying you've got to get your cholesterol down. Everything he said in this article is absolutely wrong and not based on science. And this was the leader in the field of heart disease and nutrition in America from the 1950s into the 1990s. Things got worse in the 1970s. Now the politicians got involved. George McGovern, Senator George McGovern, decided that they would get a panel together and tell Americans what was healthy food. McGovern at the time was on a low-fat diet. He had been convinced that the Pritikin diet, which is a low-fat diet, is the healthiest diet. And the experts testified before him and said, a low-fat diet is not healthy. You do not need to fear fat. What you really should fear is sugar. But McGovern chose to ignore them. And instead, his committee published what's called Dietary Goals for the United States. This now would lead the government as far as guidance to their recommendations for people as to what they should eat. It was McGovern's committee that led to the food pyramid, which came out of the USDA. And what does the food pyramid have as its base? The base is carbohydrates. The recommendation of the food pyramid is that you eat 6 to 11 servings of bread a day, with the least amount being at the top, which is fat and oil. This food pyramid is a recipe for obesity. And that is what has happened to America since this food pyramid was created. Now, McGovern's committee was not ignored by the experts. The top scientists in America, in the National Academy of Sciences, and the president of the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Philip Handler, whose specialty was physiology, he had one word for McGovern's recommendations. That one word was nonsense. The Academy came out with their own pamphlet emphasizing that McGovern's committee was wrong. And they said what is important is obesity. You need to avoid being obese, do not gain weight. But by avoiding fat is not the way to do it. The National Academy's pamphlet was completely ignored. It was McGovern's committee that took charge, and the media jumped all over the idea that fat is unhealthy. So, we're now shifting a bit. I've been emphasizing fat, but now let's talk about cholesterol. And so you've got the policeman here going to the butcher shop, as if the butcher has weapons of mass destruction. Of course, being the steak that he's selling. That steak has the cholesterol. And so here he is, he's selling this cholesterol, and he's killing people. Now we'll address the myth that cholesterol clogs arteries. All right. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a graph of the relation between cholesterol and heart disease. It may surprise you to see that this is what it looks like. This is a summary of a study of Framingham, Massachusetts. Thousands of people who were followed for decades. What they did in this work is see, well, who had heart disease and who didn't. And they related that to their cholesterol levels. And what you can see is most of the graph, the two lines overlap. And what that means, for example, here at the peak, which is at about 220, that means that there is no difference between the people who have heart disease and the people who don't have heart disease when you're at 220. And almost all of this curve, there is no difference in cholesterol levels for those who have heart disease versus those who don't have heart disease. The only place where these two curves deviate is at extremely high levels of cholesterol, which is at about 300. So hypercholesterolemia, which is what this is called, means that only if your cholesterol is 300 or more, then yes, you're at higher risk for developing heart disease. But if your cholesterol is below 300, there is no significant association between your cholesterol and heart disease. And what have the experts said about cholesterol? Well, here is the editor of the journal, the American Medical Association, 1973. He said, thanks to Madison Avenue promotion by the commercial food producers and the American Heart Association, people imagine that if they lower their blood cholesterol, they will prevent heart disease. few people realize that there has never been a proven scientific relationship between lowering cholesterol and preventing heart disease. And the reason why he said this was that at this time there had already been about a dozen studies published in which people had their cholesterol lowered, and it had absolutely no effect on their survival. At the time, you could lower cholesterol by giving people corn oil and lowering the meat in their diet. Or there were a variety of drugs at the time, which predated the statins, and you could lower cholesterol. And every single study failed at showing that you could improve mortality by lowering cholesterol. And further, there's a very important point here that I've identified in the white text. Another expert, an MD PhD, who studied cardiovascular research for decades, said an almost endless number of observations and experiments have effectively falsified the hypothesis that dietary cholesterol and fat and a high cholesterol play a causative role in atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. The hypothesis is maintained because allegedly supported but insignificant findings are inflated. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a statistical trick. This is how research supported by drug companies can take insignificant findings and make them inflated. And this is what Uffe Ravnskov was talking about. Now, as I said, every cholesterol trial had failed. Beginning in the 1950s and until 1984, every single study had failed to show that people could be healthier and live longer by lowering their cholesterol. This was a watershed event in cholesterol history. This was the first study that showed that by lowering cholesterol, you could reduce the number of people who died of heart disease. This is published in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, 1984. What they did was take about 480,000 men, and they took those who had the highest cholesterol, again, because Framingham showed that the association between heart disease and cholesterol occurred only when you're at about 290 to 300. So they accepted into this study only men that had the highest cholesterol. And they treated them with a drug which was available at the time called cholestyramine. And the cholestyramine lowered their cholesterol. And they found that those that were given the cholestyramine, compared to the control, the placebo group, had a 24% reduction in heart disease-related deaths. So this was a fantastic finding for what is called the cholesterol cartel. There was one problem with the paper which sort of buried deep in the results. The problem was that they did not improve mortality. The risk of death did not change. The same number of people died in the treated versus the placebo group. And you may wonder, how can you reduce death by 24% and yet have no difference in the groups? Well, this is how they did it. You start with the 480,000 men, and then you have 3,800. Divide them in two, and you have 1,900 that were not given treatment. These people had super high cholesterol, 290, and they said, go home, eat your butter, eat your fat, eat your meat. You're on your deathbed. With cholesterol like that, you're about to die. They didn't actually say that to them, but that was clearly understood. Their cholesterol was sky high, and they got no treatment compared to the group that got the drug. And at the end of 7.5 years, just pause for a moment. Imagine your cholesterol is 290, and you go to your doctor, and you say, how long am I going to live? You're 60 years old. How long am I going to live? And your doctor's going to forget about it. You've got to get on the statin right away. You're going to have a heart attack and die any day. Well, these people had cholesterol that was 290. And 7.5 years later, 98% of the people given the placebo did not have heart disease. Only 38 people died of heart disease 7.5 years later, starting with 1,900. And in the treated group, 30 people died. The difference was 8 people, which is actually 2% versus 1.6%. The real difference was 0.4% between these two groups. Now, how do you turn 0.4%, because this is the big effect, how do you turn 0.4% into 24%? Well, you sort of do a statistical backflip. This is sort of a way to cheat. Instead of saying 0.4%, you take a ratio of a ratio. And so basically you have 2% versus 1.6%. And so the reduction from 2% that died to 1.6% is a 24% change. And this was the first study to show any effect, 8 people. But now they were faced with a problem. They couldn't do a statistical backflip to show that it actually helped mortality. You go down to the bottom. How many people actually survived? The people that were given no treatment, in the end, how many died and how many survived? 96.3% of the people given no treatment were still alive and healthy 7.5 years later. 96.4% of those who were treated were alive. The difference is 0.1%. That is 3 people. So NIH spent $120 million on this study, testing this drug that clearly lowered cholesterol. And what did they find? That they saved 3 people, which was not statistically significant. Now, had I run this study, I would have raised the white flag. I would have said, listen, it's been 20 years, we've been lowering cholesterol with people, and we're not saving lives. So let's give up. Let's go another direction. What is remarkable is that these people declared victory. The media went crazy over this study. Here it is, the cover of Time magazine, following this study coming out. And they say cholesterol is killing Americans. Everyone has to have their cholesterol lowered. And in fact, they said, based on this study, that we will eradicate heart disease with drugs. It's truly bizarre when you follow the history of the research in heart disease in relation to cholesterol. It gets worse. Now what we have is a panel called the National Cholesterol Education Program. This followed from that original 1984 work. This is the group of scientists who establish the cholesterol levels that your doctor uses to decide if you should be treated with statins. So when you get your blood test, this is what you see. And they are recommending then that you have, when you have 200 to 239, that your cholesterol is borderline high. In fact, I just met someone outside who told me his cholesterol was 230, and therefore his doctor prescribed statins for him. It's a 240 in which they say you're in serious danger. You've got to take medication to lower your cholesterol. But remember, I showed you the results that said that there isn't an association between cholesterol and heart disease until you get to 290. So where did these people come up with these guidelines? And what are the experts saying about these guidelines? Well, again, George Mann, who said it like it is. George Mann said, no sensible person can avoid the conclusion that the NCEP is an expensive fraud perpetuated by avaricious business enterprises and dishonest scientists. This is what he's saying about the guidelines, the people who set the guidelines for cholesterol levels. Why would he say such a thing? Well, when I read this paper, I noticed something missing. Now, I have actually research that's supported by drug companies. And I am obligated, when I publish my work, to indicate that my work is supported by drug companies. It's an obvious conflict of interest statement that must be included in any publication in which people are supported by drug companies. Well, when this report came out, they did not indicate at all. Again, this is Ansel Keys' journal, Circulation. They did not report a conflict of interest statement. I searched the paper and I couldn't find if these people are paid by drug companies. There is no conflict of interest statement. In fact, if you read this paper now, you will not see a conflict of interest. So the question is, are these people being paid by the drug companies? So there was actually an expose by the media in which they said, you've got to report if these people are on the payroll for drug companies. And finally, out came a report. If you go to a website, which leads to another website, which leads to another website, you will find the conflict of interest statement, which is up here. And you see all this massive text? That's indicating all of the drug companies that are paying the authors of this paper. And let's look a little closer, because that's kind of hard to read. Let's look at the first author. First author, Dr. Grundy, is paid by 10 different drug companies. And he didn't reveal how much he's paid, but I do know that one of the authors reported that he was paid $150,000 by one drug company 1 year. Dr. Grundy is paid by 10 drug companies. So a reasonable estimate is he's first author. He must be getting at least $150,000. So Dr. Grundy perhaps is being paid $1.5 million by drug companies, which he did not reveal when these guidelines came out. And let's look at one other author, Dr. Barry Mertz. Now, she, of course, is being paid by drug companies, as are 8 of the 9 authors. But what I noticed is that she's quite the little investor. Dr. Mertz has stock in these drug companies. Now, I want you to realize something. These people set the guidelines extremely low. They're the ones that set the borderline cholesterol at 240. And when they changed the guidelines, that added 20 million Americans to the list of people who needed to have statins prescribed. So by setting these guidelines, they are clearly benefiting the drug companies. And understand that statins are the greatest revenue producers in all of medical history. Lipitor alone generates over $10 billion every single year. I mean, come on. We weren't born yesterday. Something smells pretty bad here, like week-old fish sitting out in the sun. I mean, I think your doctor should know who is setting these guidelines and that there is a conflict of interest. So I think when you get your blood test results, there should be a little disclaimer on the bottom that says these guidelines were developed by people with a financial conflict of interest. But it doesn't mean they're wrong. I mean, maybe they found something out that wasn't known before from the Framingham studies. Maybe these guidelines are right. They are scientists, after all. I mean, they're on the payroll of the drug companies, but they are scientists. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe these guidelines are accurate. No, they don't deserve the benefit of the doubt. They're wrong. How do I know they're wrong? Because the experts are saying they are wrong. Here's a paper that came out and analyzed the same data that the NCEP used to come up with the guidelines. Rodney Hayward, who's an MD at the University of Michigan Medical School and the VA hospital there, and his team analyzed the same data. And in case you can't read that, what it says is, we found no high-quality clinical evidence to support current treatment goals for cholesterol. He repeated that again in the discussion and said we could find no published high-quality evidence to support the lipid therapy. He concluded and said, we strongly suggest that those with access to the data conduct further analyses. It gets worse. He's not the only one saying this. Now what I found is an open letter to NIH and Congress, which was written in 2004 by some of the top experts in cardiovascular research in America and the UK. It is a 9-page letter which beautifully and eloquently describes the research on cholesterol and emphasizes that no woman who has not had a heart attack should take statins. No man over the age of 65 should lower his cholesterol if he has not had a heart attack. In general, most people should not be lowering their cholesterol. This is what the experts are saying. And in fact, they said, in conclusion, the American people are poorly served when government-sanctioned clinical recommendations misdirect attention and resources to expensive medical therapies that may not be scientifically justified. They're referring to statins there. Only an independent review, totally free from conflicts of interest, can restore public confidence. So they're requesting another review. They're saying you need to get scientists that are not paid by the drug companies to determine what the cholesterol guidelines should be. And here are the experts. Just some of them I've included here that signed that letter. You have people from Harvard, Stanford, NYU, UCLA. You have the director of interventional cardiology at Beth Israel Medical Center. You've got Columbia University physicians, Johns Hopkins, and University of California, Davis. So you've got experts from all over the US as well as the UK saying the NCEP guidelines are inaccurate. So what did NIH say in response to this letter? Well, here is how it starts, and they're acknowledging that you are requesting a re-review of the data. And this letter then goes on for a while to say basically the NCEP is right. And so he said thanks, but no thanks. The Institute does not believe a re-review of the data is warranted at this time. And it has not been done since that time. You are still seeing the same recommendations that were made in 2004 by people on the payroll for drug companies as far as cholesterol lowering. So I would suggest that we have two disclaimers when you get a blood test. The first saying, this is developed by people with a financial conflict of interest, but your doctor should also know, and you should know. The second disclaimer is, these guidelines have been disputed by scientists without a conflict of interest. Now, I have heard people say, but don't statins enable you to live longer? Actually, no. You do not live longer if you're lowering your cholesterol. Nothing has changed from the 1984 study and everything that failed before that. The latest analysis, this is out 2010, a meta-analysis involving 65,000 people, in which you look at whether or not people live longer after having a heart attack. The answer is no. You see, I've underlined the not. They could not find evidence that people on statins would have any benefit as far as mortality. Lowering cholesterol does not enable you to live longer. If you ask your doctor, if you've had a heart attack, if I take the statin, will I live longer? The answer should be no, but it's unlikely your doctor will be aware of this. Well, what about the possibility that taking a statin will make it less likely you'll have a heart attack? So your cholesterol is high, and your doctor says you've got to take the statin, so you're less likely to have a heart attack. Well, is that true? Well, sort of. This is how it was put by Dr. Jerome Hoffman, professor of medicine at UCLA. This refers to what's called number needed to treat. How many people do you need to treat with a statin before you will reduce a single heart attack? So what he said was, you have to put 250 people in a room, tell them that they will pay $1,000 a year for the drugs. They will have side effects, such as diarrhea and muscle pain, and only one person will benefit. That is the sum total effect of statins. You need to treat 250 people to reduce one heart attack in one person. Now, what Dr. Hoffman is actually not covering is that there are far more adverse side effects to statins than just getting diarrhea and muscle pain. The first is statins adversely affect the brain, especially Lipitor. It is the worst of all. And here's a book written by an MD who was taking statins, and he found a powerful effect on his ability to remember information. So he wrote a book about it and researched the topic. He titled it Lipitor, Thief of Memory: Statin Drugs and the Misguided War on Cholesterol. In addition, and again, I'm looking only at high-quality medical journals, there are numerous adverse side effects that you have with statins, including erectile dysfunction. It actually causes type 2 diabetes, rhabdomyolysis, acute renal failure. Cancer is actually very common, either with statins or in any people who have low cholesterol. Low cholesterol is highly correlated with cancer, as well as with taking statins. And of course, liver dysfunction. All that to save one heart attack out of 250 people. Finally, there are two issues that I've raised. and that is, why was it that we had so many people having heart attacks in America? Half of all people died of heart attacks in the 1950s. And the second thing is, what about cholesterol? Is it a villain or is it a misunderstood hero? Okay, remember this graph I showed you in which heart disease was increasing dramatically in America in the first half of the 20th century. This is what Ancel Keys attributed to people eating more fat. Well, the first thing is there a relation between the amount of butter people were eating and this increase in heart disease? And the answer is no. In this graph, the blue line shows the amount of butter Americans were consuming across the 20th century. And what you see is actually, beginning in the 1930s, the consumption of butter declined dramatically, and it was replaced by margarine. So margarine actually became a health food as people were eating less butter, and they were saying eat margarine so you won't have a heart attack. And in fact, as the margarine consumption is increasing, you're actually seeing more heart disease and more cancer. Because we now know, of course, that the trans fats that are present in margarine actually cause heart disease and cancer. So the first thing is, there never has been any evidence that butter causes heart disease. And it very well is that what appeared to be a health food, the margarine, was actually contributing to heart disease. And what about saturated fat, which has been vilified by the media? Well, there is no increase in saturated fat. That is this line right here, the amount of saturated fat that people are eating across the years in America. So there's no association of any change in saturated fat with the increase in people dying of heart disease in America. The answer is really quite simple if you want to look at one major factor as to why more Americans were dying of heart disease, and that's smoking. Americans became smokers in the 20th century. You look at a correlation now of cigarette consumption and lung cancer, and it's pretty obvious. Everybody knows cigarettes cause lung cancer. And here, if you look across the first half of the 20th century, you see a linear increase in the number of cigarettes that people smoked. At the turn of the century, people didn't smoke much. But by the 1940s and 1950s, half of all Americans were smoking. And of course, you can see here, it's an intriguing graph. There is a 20-year delay. From the time people started smoking till you then see lung cancer increasing in America, there is this delay. And this delay is based on a 20-year delay in which it takes cigarettes to cause lung cancer. But now let's look at that graph in relation to heart disease. And they're remarkably similar. As people were smoking more, they were developing more heart disease. And it is very consistent. We know that smokers have about a 5 times higher rate of heart disease than non-smokers. Ancel Keys didn't have to lie about fat. It was smoking that was increasing the incidence of heart disease. We're almost finished, Cheryl. Almost finished. Okay, last thing. So, I'll give you in 2 minutes what actually causes heart disease. What causes heart disease, first of all, is sugar. How does sugar do it? Sugar attaches to protein in a process called glycation. And it's actually the sugar molecule that attaches to your arteries and makes them stiff.
We just had dessert.
Oh, a little bit of sugar is okay. So the sugar attaches to your arteries and makes them stiff. When you have an increase in blood pressure, that artery tears. Okay? So you have this micro tear in your artery. And what's the most important part of the recent research is that you have bacteria that now invade the torn artery. These are the very same bacteria that cause gum disease and respiratory infections. These bacteria go into your arteries and cause damage. So the essence of heart disease is a tear followed by an infection. Now is where it takes a very nice twist. What happens after you have an infection? You are protected by your immune system. Your white blood cells work with your LDL cholesterol. That's the bad cholesterol. The bad cholesterol comes to the rescue. It is your LDL cholesterol working with your white blood cells that go inside the artery and attack the bacteria. The LDL cholesterol surrounds the bacteria and kills it. And that is why when you look at a plaque, you will find dead bacteria and you will find white blood cells along with the LDL, because it is an infection that has been fought by the white blood cells and the LDL. And that is why inside a plaque you will find cholesterol, because it is actually used to repair the tissue. The cholesterol doesn't cause the damage. It, in fact, is basically the spackle. Okay? It is the glue that helps the artery to be repaired. It is the hero. It is not the villain. And finally, the reason why the artery gets clogged is not because the cholesterol is sticking to the surface. What's happening is, as your artery is repeatedly damaged, it swells. The wall of the membrane swells. Each time you've got to put more cholesterol in to repair the tissue, the wall of the artery gets thicker until eventually the artery is choked off and you have a blood clot that comes along and fills in that hole and you have a heart attack. So, in conclusion, the myth 1, saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease, crush that one. The second one, that cholesterol clogs arteries and that you'll live longer if you lower your cholesterol, forget about it. And finally, we've been misled. We've been misled by food companies that have emphasized that we eat low-fat food. We've been misled by drug companies that emphasize that we have to lower our cholesterol with medication. And we've been misled by the government, which has come up with guidelines both for food and cholesterol that are not justified by the science. So here we are, humans supremely adapted to processed meat. And what's happened to us is a very ugly scene in the end. And I'm emphasizing that's the sugar in the drink that's made such ugliness. I also want to emphasize, I have learned all this by reading from the experts, not the people who have made the myths. And I've benefited here by reading from these experts, as well as science writers who are at the top. And the ones that are outlined in white are the ones who have spent a lot of time in contact, sending me emails and explaining to me about nutrition and heart disease. Now we can have questions.
I think that's